The mist did not creep. It fell upon the highlands like a shroud, swallowing the sharp peaks and deep valleys of the Caledonian wilderness in a single silent breath. For Centurion Marcus Valerius, leading the vanguard of the mighty Ninth Legion, this was more than just weather. It was the first sign that the land itself resisted them. Governor Agricola's orders had been clear: subdue the rebellious Mistwalkers tribe, a people whispered to be more spirit than flesh, and secure this northern frontier for Rome. But as the dense, gray fog coiled around the marching column of 5,000 men, muffling the rhythmic tramp of their sandaled feet and the clatter of their armor, the mission felt less like a campaign and more like a descent. Their torches, lit against the premature gloom of the afternoon, flickered not with warm golden flame, but with a sickly, unnatural green. The eerie light cast long, dancing shadows that seemed to twist and writhe independently of the men who carried them. Legionary Lucius, young and still brimming with the invincibility of his first major campaign, laughed aloud at the phenomenon. He nudged the veteran marching beside him, cracking a joke about the local spirits being afraid of Roman steel. His laughter, however, echoed hollowly in the suffocating silence and died quickly, finding no purchase in the grim faces of the seasoned soldiers around him. These men, scarred by battles from Germania to Britannia, did not share his mirth. Their hands tightened on their pilum shafts, and their eyes, wide and wary, scanned the impenetrable wall of fog that pressed in on all sides. Marcus, his crimson crest and polished armor marking him as a pillar of authority, felt the shift in his men's morale like a physical chill. He rode his horse along the column, his stern gaze missing nothing. He saw the way the veterans' shoulders tensed, how they glanced over their shoulders at nothing, how the unnatural green fire reflected in their anxious eyes. This would not do. Discipline was the backbone of the Legion, the one certainty in a world of chaos. Allowing superstition to fester was a poison that could cripple an army faster than any enemy's sword. He reined in his horse at a small rise, turning to face the long, snaking line of his legion. His voice, trained to carry across the din of battle, cut through the muffled air. He spoke of Rome, of duty, of the unbreakable will that had carved an empire from the world. He reminded them that they were the sons of Mars, that no fog-dwelling tribal superstition could stand against their organized might. His words were strong, confident, a hammer beating back the insidious fear. The men straightened their backs, the familiar litany of empire and honor steeling their resolve. Yet, as Marcus finished his speech and the column began to move once more, a profound unease settled deep within his own chest. His words felt like a shield made of parchment against an enemy he could not see. The mist continued to swirl, thick and cold, and as they made camp for the night, it felt less like they were settling on land, and more like they were anchoring themselves in a vast, formless sea. The green-tinged torchlight created a small, fragile island of visibility in an ocean of gray. Sentries were posted at tight intervals, their figures becoming hazy ghosts just a few paces out. Marcus stood at the edge of the light, staring into the roiling gloom. He felt a cold that had nothing to do with the northern air seep into his bones. The mist seemed to watch them, to breathe with a slow, patient intelligence, and in its silent, swirling depths, he sensed the first, faint whispers of an unseen and ancient force stirring against them. The scouts returned, not with news of enemy encampments or defensible positions, but with a chill that had settled deep in their souls. They had found the stones just beyond a ridge, half swallowed by peat and moss. The carvings were not crude tribal markings, but intricate, spiraling symbols that seemed to writhe in the flat, grey light. They depicted formless beings of coiling mist and elongated, shadowy gods with eyes of hollow darkness. The stone itself was ice-cold to the touch, a deep, penetrating cold that lingered on the fingertips long after contact was broken. The scouts reported their find with hushed voices, their usual swagger replaced by a superstitious dread, their eyes constantly darting toward the ever-present fog that clung to the highlands like a funeral shroud. Later that same day, a patrol dragging a struggling, wild-eyed man, clad in deerskin and woad, presented their prize to Centurion Marcus. The captive, a Mist Walker scout, did not struggle for long. He stood before Marcus, his chest heaving, his gaze not fearful but filled with a terrible, knowing pity. He spoke in broken, guttural Latin, his voice a dry rustle. He warned them of gods who wore the mist as a cloak and shadows as their servants. He told Marcus that to tread further was to step outside the stream of time, to be forgotten by the world and condemned to an eternity of wandering, their footsteps echoing in a grey nowhere. Marcus, his jaw set like granite, listened in stony silence. He saw the effect the man's words had on the legionaries standing guard, the way their knuckles whitened on their weapons. To let such heresy and fear-mongering spread was unthinkable. With a sharp, merciless gesture, he ordered the man's execution. The axe fell, and the warning was silenced, but the words themselves seemed to hang in the air, absorbed by the hungry mist. As darkness fell, the camp became a fragile constellation of flickering green torchlight in an infinite sea of grey. Legionary Lucius, taking his turn on watch, found no comfort in the familiar weight of his shield. The world beyond the palisade was a formless void, a silence so profound it became a pressure on the eardrums. Then the whispers began. They were not the rustle of wind through heather but faint, sibilant voices speaking in languages unknown, harsh, sibilant consonants and guttural, ancient tongues that seemed to coil out of the fog itself. They spoke just at the edge of hearing, sometimes from one direction, sometimes from all around, never loud enough to understand, but always present, a maddening, spectral chorus. Throughout the night, soldiers on watch reported seeing things. Shadowy figures, tall and impossibly thin, moved at the very limits of the torchlight. They did not walk so much as drift, their forms blending and shifting within the mist, there one moment and gone the next. One sentry swore he saw a figure standing motionless, watching him, only for it to dissolve into the fog when he blinked. Another reported the sound of many feet marching in perfect unison, a phantom legion keeping pace with their own just out of sight. When these reports reached Marcus in his command tent, he met them with the centurion's practiced scorn. He dismissed the whispers as the wind and the figures, as the product of tired eyes and fearful minds playing tricks in the treacherous fog. He walked the camp perimeter himself, his own senses straining against the oppressive gloom, and declared it empty. He ordered the men to focus on their duty, to trust in their training and their steel. But his commands, once a source of absolute certainty, now rang hollow. The tension among the men was a palpable force, thick as the mist itself. They huddled closer to their fires, their jokes and songs dying unborn. They watched the darkness with wide, unblinking eyes, every man holding his breath, listening for the next whisper, waiting for the next shadow, to step out of the endless gray and into their fragile circle of light. The trail ahead should have been virgin ground, untouched by any Roman boot. Yet, there, in the churned mud and damp peat, were the unmistakable impressions of their own Caligi, the distinctive hobnailed soles of legionary sandals. The prints were identical in every detail to the ones the column was making at that very moment, but they were fresher, the water only just beginning to seep into their sharp edges, as if the makers had passed mere minutes before. A low murmur rippled through the ranks, a current of confusion that cut deeper than the previous night's whispers. Centurion Marcus ordered a halt, his own horse skittish as he dismounted to examine the impossible trail. The ground told a story they were still living, a paradox written in mud and mist. They pressed on, the air growing heavier, thick with a strange, buzzing silence that seemed to swallow sound itself. Then the world flickered. For a heartbeat, the fog ahead thinned, and a dozen men at the front of the column gasped in unison. There, marching away from them, was the unmistakable rear of their own formation. The same men, the same armor, the same tired, slumped shoulders. They saw the backs of their own helmets, the sway of their own packs. A perfect mirror of their current march, but several hundred paces ahead on the path. The vision lasted only a second before the fog slammed shut like a curtain, leaving the men staring at empty, gray wilderness. A cold dread, colder than the highland air, began to coil in their guts. They were not just lost in space, but adrift in time. Panic, when it came, was swift and brutal. A young legionary from the third cohort suddenly screamed, pointing a trembling finger into the mist to their left. He babbled, his words tumbling over one another, that he had just seen his own self, his own face staring back at him with wide, terrified eyes before the apparition simply dissolved into nothingness, vanishing like a breath on glass. The man's terror was infectious, a spark on tinder-dry kindling. The tight Roman discipline, the very foundation of their might, began to crack. Men shoved against each other, their eyes wild voices rising in a cacophony of fear and confusion. The centurion's shouts were lost in the tumult. Marcus fought his way to the center of the chaos, his voice a roar of pure authority that cut through the hysteria. He grabbed the panicked soldier by the shoulder, his grip like iron, forcing the man to look at him, to focus on a point of reality. He barked orders, his command sharp and immediate. The column was to reform. Shields were to be locked. He instituted a double watch for the coming night, ordering that no man was to be more than an arm's length from his comrade. His presence was a rock in a churning sea, and slowly, by sheer force of will, he restored a semblance of order. The men fell back into line, their formations tight, but their faces were pale, their eyes haunted. They marched on, but now every shadow in the mist seemed to hold the shape of a man. Every flicker of movement at the edge of vision felt like a glimpse of their own doomed future. The path was no longer just a physical track through the highlands. It had become a warping, treacherous thread through time itself, and with every step, the Legion felt the fabric of their reality fraying at the edges, deepening their fear into a profound, soul-chilling certainty that they were marching headlong into a trap from which there was no escape. The air itself began to bleed sound. It started as a low hum, a vibration that seemed to emanate from the very stones underfoot, then swelled into a cacophony of war that defied all reason. Echoes of battle cries and crisp, commanding Latin shouts to form testudos and hold the line clashed with savage roars in guttural, unknown tongues, languages that sounded both impossibly ancient and jarringly futuristic. The sounds overlapped, layered upon one another, creating a tapestry of conflict that spanned centuries. Men heard the whistle of arrows from long-forgotten bows alongside the sharp, percussive reports that sounded like nothing they had ever known. It was the noise of a battlefield that existed outside of time, a phantom war raging just beyond the veil of mist, and the Legion was marching directly into its heart. A patrol of 8 men, sent to scout a nearby gully, became the first direct victims of this auditory assault. They had only just vanished into the thick, grey wall when the screams began, not the distant echoes, but close, raw, and personal. There was a sudden, sharp cry of alarm, cut off with brutal finality, followed by the frantic shouts of their comrades. Then, a silence more terrifying than any noise descended. When the mist momentarily thinned, the 6 remaining soldiers stumbled back into camp, their faces masks of pure terror. They reported that a living tendril of fog, thick as soup and cold as a winter river, had coiled out of the gully and enveloped their 2 rear men. There had been a brief, violent struggle, the sounds of choking and desperate scrabbling hands, and then nothing. The mist had receded, leaving behind empty ground and unnerving stillness. The 2 men were simply gone, swallowed without a trace. Later, as the shaken Legion tried to fortify its position, Legionary Lucius, his earlier bravado now a distant memory, stumbled over a half-buried object near the perimeter. He dug it out with trembling hands, his breath catching in his throat. It was a Roman helmet, an imperial Gallic type, identical to the one he wore. But this one was ancient, pitted with a rust that spoke of centuries, not days. The crest was long gone, and the metal was brutally dented, as if from a mighty blow. When his fingers brushed against the cold iron, a jolt of pure, soul-deep ice shot up his arm, a cold that felt less like temperature and more like the touch of death itself. He dropped the helmet as if it were a venomous serpent, staring at the artifact from a future that should not exist, a ghostly promise of their own decay. Centurion Marcus, his own composure frayed to a thread, sought answers in the only way he knew how: direct interrogation. He found one of the surviving patrol members, a veteran named Gaius, huddled by a fire, his body racked with tremors that had nothing to do with the cold. The man's eyes were wide and unseeing, fixed on some horror only he could witness. Marcus knelt, his voice low and urgent, demanding a report. The soldier's words were a broken whisper. He described the enveloping mist, the disappearance of his friends, but then his story fractured. He swore, on his honor, and by all the gods, that just before the silence fell, he had heard it clearly, a scream of pure, unadulterated agony, a final, desperate cry for a mother who lived far to the south. And he knew, with a certainty that had shattered his mind, that the voice screaming his own name in its death throes had been his own. The attack came not with a war cry, but with the mist itself turning lethal. One moment, the Romans were tense, huddled formation in the endless gray. The next, the fog congealed into human forms that solidified from the vapor. The mist walkers were upon them, their bodies seeming to flicker between solid flesh and swirling mist, their movements a silent, fluid dance of death. They wielded weapons that were nightmares, given form daggers and axes that phased in and out of reality, sometimes gleaming with a cold, spectral light, other times appearing as nothing more than shimmers in the air. They struck from within the very bank of fog, their attacks impossible to predict, their forms dissolving before a counter-strike could land. The Roman discipline, homed on 100 battlefields, snapped into a desperate, chaotic defense. Shields were raised, not against a visible enemy line, but against phantoms that materialized from the gloom to their left, their right, even from within their own ranks. A legionary would grunt in surprise as a spear of solidified mist punched through his leather armor, only for the attacker to vanish before the man hit the ground. The air filled with the grunts of men, the clash of gladius on weapons that felt both solid and insubstantial, and the wet, sickening sounds of steel finding flesh. The Romans fought with the grim determination of professionals, but they were swatting at shadows. For every mistwalker that seemed to stagger from a blow, two more would phase into existence from the opaque wall surrounding them. Lucius found himself at the center of the storm, his shield a useless weight against an enemy that attacked from all angles. He parried a blow from a tribesman who seemed made of woven darkness, his gladius meeting a blade that felt like ice and shattered air. As he recovered, a flicker of movement to his side caught his eye. A tribesman, his face a canvas of swirling blue woad and mist, lunged at him. In the man's hand was a dagger that was not metal, but a shard of solidified twilight, a weapon that seemed to drink the light from the air around it. Lucius threw himself backward, his balance gone, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt a wave of intense, soul-numbing cold pass so close to his throat that the skin prickled with frost. The spectral dagger phased through the space his neck had occupied a moment before, and the tribesman melted back into the fog, his expression one of serene, timeless patience. Lucius scrambled to his feet, gasping, the memory of that killing cold etched into his mind. Centurion Marcus, fighting with controlled fury at the head of his men, saw it all with a clarity that turned his blood to ice. He saw his soldiers' swords pass harmlessly through misty forms. He saw the tribesmen's weapons solidify only at the moment of impact, and he saw the wounded Romans clutching at injuries that seeped a strange, silvery vapor instead of blood. This was not a battle. It was a slaughter against an enemy that played by rules beyond the physical world. The stories, the whispers, the warping path it all coalesced into a single, horrifying truth. They were not fighting men. They were fighting the land, the mist, the very gods of this haunted place. His command, his authority, his entire understanding of warfare was useless here. With a roar of frustration and tactical necessity, he bellowed the order for a tactical retreat. Fall back. Reform on the trail. Testudo formation. The order was echoed down the line, and the beleaguered Romans began a desperate, fighting withdrawal, locking their shields overhead and to the sides in the familiar protective shell. They backed away from the swirling, murderous fog, step by painful step, expecting at any moment to be overwhelmed. But the Mistwalkers did not press their advantage. As suddenly as they had appeared, they began to fade, their forms dissipating back into the general gloom, their silent, spectral assault over. They left behind a scene of carnage and confusion, several dozen Romans wounded with those chilling, vapor-bleeding injuries, and a profound, gut-wrenching fear. The Legion breathing heavily, its formation battered but intact, finally reached the path they had marched in on, ready to put distance between themselves and this nightmare. But when they turned to look back the way they had come, a new, deeper horror dawned. The path behind them, the one that should have led back to the safety of the lowlands, to their supply lines, to Rome itself, was gone. In its place was only more featureless, rolling highland and the same endless, waiting, hungry mist. They were not retreating. They were trapped. The fire, that most ancient comfort of mankind, had turned against them. As the bruised purple twilight deepened into an unnaturally black night, the Legion's torches and campfires did not burn with reassuring gold or orange, but erupted in hues of spectral blue and sickly, phosphorescent green. The flames themselves seemed to move with the liquid, alien languor, casting a light that did not illuminate so much as distort. Shadows, once simple absences of light, now writhed with a life of their own. The long, dark shapes thrown by the men stretched and contracted, twisting into impossible angles, their movements a grotesque pantomime, independent of the soldiers who cast them. A legionary standing still would watch his own shadow crawl up the side of a tent, like a monstrous insect, or split into two figures that wrestled silently on the ground before merging back into one. Within these pools of colored light, the mist began to birth phantoms. Soldiers, huddled for warmth and solace, saw figures moving in the shimmering air above the flames. Some were Roman ghostly legionaries in armor styles both familiar and archaic, their faces etched with a timeless exhaustion, marching in a silent, endless column. Others were tribal, tall, and gaunt, with eyes of flickering ember, their forms woven from the same mist that birthed the flames. These illusions were soundless, fleeting but terrifyingly vivid. A man would see the face of a long-dead comrade staring at him from a green flame, or a mist-walker shaman pointing bony finger directly at his heart, only for the image to dissolve when he cried out. The camp became a gallery of haunting, silent tableaus. Each torch a window into a different layer of the nightmare. From the midst of the terrified ranks, a voice rose not of panic, but of grim prophecy. It was Decimus, an older legionary from the 8th cohort, a man known more for his quiet piety and knowledge of auguries than for his skill with a sword. His face, lit from below by a torch burning with cold cerulean fire, was a mask of stark terror and absolute certainty. He pushed his way toward Centurion, Marcus, his eyes wide, his voice a raw scrape. He spoke of the gods of the mist and the mountain, ancient deities of stream and stone, whose names were forgotten by Rome. He declared that the legion's very presence was a desecration, their hobnailed boots tearing at the sacred flesh of the land. The colored flames, he warned, were a sign of their anger. They were trespassers in a temple they were too blind to see. And the shifting shadows and phantom legions were the first gentle warnings before the true wrath of the gods fell upon them. Marcus listened, his own shadow a giant, twitching beast on the canvas of his command tent behind him. The rational part of his mind, the part forged in the logic of Roman warfare, screamed that Decimus was a cancer, a spark of mutiny that had to be excised immediately. To allow such talk to spread was to surrender the legion to madness. His hand dropped to the hilt of his Pugio, his fingers curling around the familiar, solid ivory. The act of drawing it, of silencing the seer, with a single efficient thrust, would be a powerful message. It would reassert control, demonstrate that fear was a greater enemy than any phantom, and remind every man that Roman discipline was the only god they answered to on this campaign. His knuckles were white on the dagger's hilt. His arm tensed to draw. He met Decimus's desperate gaze, seeing not insolence, but a profound, helpless horror. The man was not inciting rebellion. He was begging for their lives. In that moment, Marcus saw the fragile thread of his command, not as a chain of orders, but as a web of shared terror. To kill Decimus would not kill the fear. It would only give it a martyr. It would confirm every unspeakable suspicion in the minds of his men. His jaw clenched, a muscle twitching in his cheek. The moment stretched, thick with tension. Then, with a slow, deliberate exhalation, he forced his hand to relax and fall away from the dagger. He stayed his hand, not out of mercy, but out of a cold, dawning realization that the seer's madness might be the only truth they had left. He turned away from Decimus without a word, leaving the prophet of doom standing alone in the blasphemous light, his unheeded warning hanging in the air like a funeral shroud. The command tent felt less like a bastion of authority and more like a tomb, the air thick with the scent of fear and the unearthly blue-green glow of torches that painted the officers' faces in ghastly hues. Centurion Marcus Valerius stood before his assembled tribunes and senior centurions, the map of the highlands lying between them like a useless relic of a world that no longer existed. The arguments for retreat, once whispered in the ranks, were now voiced openly by grim-faced men who had seen their soldiers vanish into mist and their own shadows turn against them. They spoke of cutting their losses, of fighting their way back through the spectral terrain, of abandoning this cursed campaign before the Legion was erased from existence entirely. Their words were practical, born of a soldier's instinct for survival. But to Marcus, each one felt like a nail being driven into the coffin of his command and his honor. He let the dissenting voices fill the tent, his own silence a heavy counterweight. He watched the play of the unnatural light on their anxious faces, saw the way their eyes avoided his, fixed instead on the twisting, living shadows on the canvas walls. When the last plea for retreat faded into the oppressive stillness, Marcus straightened his shoulders, the movement causing his own monstrous shadow to loom large behind him. He began to speak, his voice low at first, then rising with a forced, passionate heat. He spoke of Rome, not as a distant city of marble, but as an idea, an unbreakable will that had tamed continents and civilized the world. He invoked the honor of the Ninth Legion, their storied history, the eagle standard that demanded they conquer, not flee from phantoms and fog. He painted a picture of crushing the tribe's heart, of proving that Roman discipline and steel could master even the supernatural, of a victory that would echo through the ages. But the passion was a shield, and a brittle one. As he spoke of empire and destiny, his own voice betrayed him. It wavered on the final ringing declarations, the timbre cracking under the immense, unseen pressure of the mist that pressed against the tent. The words that were meant to inspire felt hollow, theatrical, a performance for an audience that could see the terror in his own eyes. He finished, his chest heaving, the echo of his speech swallowed by the silent, watching mist outside. The officers stood in stunned silence, not inspired, but frozen by the stark contrast between the grand ideals he had proclaimed and the fragile, desperate man who had uttered them. It was then that Lucius stepped forward. The young legionary, his face pale but his jaw set, had been standing guard at the tent's entrance. He had heard every word of the council, every fearful argument, and the centurion's trembling resolve. He did not ask permission. He simply volunteered to scout ahead at first light, to find a path any path that might lead them to the tribe's center. His voice was steady, devoid of the brash humor he'd carried on the march north, replaced by a simple, unadorned bravery. It was the act of a man choosing to walk into the unknown, not for glory, but for the comrade beside him. His offer cut through the tension in the tent like a clean blade. Other junior officers, shamed by his quiet courage, murmured their own assent, a flicker of the Legion's old spirit rekindling in the blasphemous light. Marcus dismissed the council, the officers filing out into the haunted night with a new, grim purpose. But as the tent flap fell closed, leaving him alone, the centurion's resolve crumbled. The impassioned speech felt like ash in his mouth. He had just ordered what remained of his legion deeper into the trap, gambling their lives and their very souls on a conviction he no longer fully possessed. Doubt, cold and insidious, uncoiled in his gut. He had invoked honor, but what honor was there in leading men to be unmade by mist? He had spoken of empire, but what empire could claim a land that devoured its conquerors? He walked to the entrance and pulled the flap aside, staring out into the camp. The torches burned their eerie colors, the shadows danced, and the mist, thicker and heavier than ever before, began to creep back toward the fragile circle of light, as if in answer to his unspoken fears. The mist no longer waited beyond the perimeter. It had become the perimeter. It seeped through the gaps in the palisade, not as a passive weather phenomenon, but as a slow, deliberate tide of living vapor. It pooled in the low points of the camp, then began to climb, tendrils of gray smoke slithering under tent flaps and coiling around the legs of the night watch. The first disappearance was marked only by a choked-off gurgle and the soft thud of a body hitting the damp earth. A sentry standing his post simply vanished, his spear clattering to the ground. The spot where he had stood now occupied by a swirling, denser patch of fog that pulsed once, slowly, before settling back into the general gloom. Panic was instantaneous and silent, a contagion of wide eyes and frantically pointed fingers in the eerie colored torchlight. Lucius was roused from a fitful doze by the commotion. He scrambled from his tent, his gladius in hand, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The camp was a scene of surreal horror. The blue and green flames cast long, dancing shadows. But now, the mist itself seemed to be casting shadows, thick, coiling shapes that moved with predatory intent. He saw a tendril of fog, thick as a man's arm, slide into a tent across the pathway. There was a brief, muffled struggle, the sound of a body being dragged across the ground, and then silence. The tent flap hung still. Lucius stared, frozen, as his friend Pulo, bleary-eyed and armed with a shield, emerged from his own shelter nearby. Their eyes met across the chaos, a shared moment of terror. Then it happened. A bank of mist that had been pooling near the latrine suddenly surged forward, not like a wave, but like a hand. It wrapped around Polo's legs, cold and shockingly solid. He cried out, a sharp, startled yell, and tried to brace his shield. But the mist was relentless. It yanked him from his feet, dragging him across the muddy ground toward the waiting wall of grey. Lucius sprang forward, his own fear forgotten, screaming his friend's name. He grabbed for Polo's outstretched hand, their fingertips brushing for a fleeting second. He felt an impossible cold and numbness that shot up his arm. Then Polo was gone, pulled into the opaque wall with a final echoing scream that was cut off with such abrupt finality. It was as if a door had been slammed shut on the world. Lucius stood alone, his hand still outstretched, the memory of that icy touch burning in his fingers. His friend's name, a silent scream on his lips. By the time a semblance of order was forced upon the camp, the scale of the loss was staggering. Centurion Marcus, his face a grim mask in the pulsating light, moved through the ranks, conducting a frantic head count. The numbers were a physical blow. Dozens were missing, not dead from wounds, not lost to desertion, but erased. Their tents stood empty. Their gear lay scattered where they had slept, but the men themselves were simply gone, swallowed by the silent, hungry mist. Marcus felt a profound, gut-wrenching helplessness settle over him. This was an enemy against which no shield wall could form, no pilum could be thrown. His authority, his strategies, his very role as a leader was meaningless. He was not a centurion guarding his men. He was a shepherd watching his flock be taken by a wolf made of air and shadow. With the camp in ruins and morale shattered into 1,000 pieces, the survivors did the only thing left to them. They abandoned their individual tents and huddled together in the center of the camp, a tight, shivering mass of humanity surrounded by a ring of sputtering, multicolored torches. They sat back to back, shields forming, a desperate, fragile shell around them, their eyes fixed on the shifting gray wall that encircled them. And then they heard it. From the mist, impossibly close, came the sound of marching. It was not the ragged, fearful step of their own sentries. It was the crisp, perfect, rhythmic tramp of a full legion on the move, the crunch of hobnailed sandals on gravel, the jingle of harnesses, the dull thud of thousands of feet moving as one. The sound passed by them, so near they could almost feel the vibration. A ghostly army marching in perfect unison through the impenetrable fog, a phantom echo of their own doomed mission, a reminder that they were not the first to be trapped here, and they would not be the last. The path did not so much end as unravel, spilling the beleaguered remnants of the 9th Legion into a clearing that defied all logic. The mist here was different, not a wall, but a shimmering, silver veil that hung motionless in the air, humming with a low, resonant frequency that vibrated in the teeth and bones. The ground underfoot was a perfect circle of pale, spongy moss that seemed to absorb sound, creating a pocket of unnerving silence within the greater silence of the highlands. And then the echoes began, not of sound, but of sight. The air within the clearing rippled like disturbed water, and through the shimmer, the Legionaries saw themselves, not as reflections, but as living, breathing visions. They watched the ghostly image of their own column marching past, weary and grin-faced, a perfect replica of their arrival in the clearing just moments before. Then the vision shifted, showing them haggard and desperate, their armor dented and cloaks torn, a possible future only days away. The air became a kaleidoscope of their own journey. Moments from the past, the first green-tinged torches, the initial skirmishes with the mist walkers bleeding into terrifying glimpses of a desolate, endless march through a grayer, more barren version of this same land. Centurion Marcus stood rooted to the spot, his command forgotten as the fabric of time tore open before his eyes. His gaze was caught by a figure that strode through the shimmering air. At the clearing's edge, it was him, but aged decades. This Marcus was a specter of relentless duty, his face a roadmap of deep crevices and bitter resolve, his hair and crest gone fully white, his armor scarred and tarnished by untold years. Yet his back was straight, his eyes held the same flinty determination, and he still led, his mouth moving in a silent shout as he urged on a column of equally ancient, spectral legionaries. The vision was a gut punch, a horrifying premonition of a command that would never end, a duty that would outlast his own body and soul. He watched his future self fade back into the silver mist, the weight of that eternal burden settling on his shoulders like a physical yoke. Nearby, Lucius faced his own phantom, a shadowy duplicate of himself, stepped from the rippling air, a perfect copy down to the smudge of dirt on its cheek and the fearful widening of its eyes. It moved toward him, its steps silent on the moss, its hand reaching out as if in supplication or warning. Lucius recoiled, raising his gladius, but the blade passed through the apparition's chest, as if through smoke. The shadow Lucius did not attack, it simply stared, its expression a terrifying blend of his own courage and a bottomless despair he had not yet allowed himself to feel. For a long, heart-stopping moment, they were locked in that silent confrontation, a man facing the ghost of his own spirit. Then, as if a silent bell had tolled, the duplicate dissolved, its form unraveling into strands of darkness that were swallowed by the shimmering veil, leaving Lucius alone and trembling. The memory of his own hopeless eyes seared into his mind. The disorientation that swept through the ranks was absolute. Men cried out, pointing at visions of their own deaths, their own past triumphs, their own childhoods spent under a warm Italian sun, all playing out simultaneously in the maddening silver air. Some tried to speak to their phantom selves, their voices cracking with desperation. Others covered their eyes, but the visions seeped through their eyelids, projected directly onto their terrified minds. The tight Roman formation, the last vestige of their discipline, dissolved into a chaotic swirl of confused soldiers stumbling through the temporal storm, their sense of self and reality fracturing with every impossible glimpse. Marcus, shaking off the horror of his aged self, knew with a soldier's instinct that to remain was to be unmade. He bellowed an order, his voice raw and strained, to move, to run, to get out of the clearing at all costs. The command, amplified by the centurions, cut through the panic. The men, grasping at this shred of purpose, surged forward as one, A desperate, headlong rush for the far tree line. They crashed through the shimmering veil, expecting to find the familiar, if treacherous, highland trail. Instead, after a dozen frantic heartbeats of running through identical, mist-wreathed birch trees, they burst back into the same clearing from the exact opposite side, their own frantic footprints still fresh in the pale moss. They skidded to a halt, their breath catching in their throats. The shimmering air still hummed. The temporal echoes still played out their silent dramas. They had not escaped the loop. They had completed it. They were trapped, not just in a place, but in a moment, prisoners of an echo that was slowly becoming their only reality. The path that was not a path dissolved into a vast, circular clearing. A place that felt less like a part of the highlands and more like a wound in the world. At its center stood a ring of towering, lichen-crusted monolith. Their surfaces etched with the same spiraling, alien symbols the scouts had found days before. The stones pulsed with a faint inner light, a cold silver luminescence that probed in time with a low, guttural chant that seemed to emanate from the very air. The mist here was not a blanket, but a living tapestry, weaving itself into the forms of the mistwalkers. They stood between the stones, dozens of them, their bodies woven from vapor and shadow, their eyes burning with the same silver light as the monoliths. They chanted in a language that was all harsh consonants and sibilant whispers, a tongue that predated Rome, predated empires, a sound that spoke of stone and ice and endless patient time. Before the largest stone stood a figure that commanded the eye and sickened the soul. The shaman was a being of concentrated shadow, a human-shaped void that drank the eerie light from the air around it. Wrappings of what looked like solidified darkness clung to its form, and where a face should have been, there was only a swirling vortex of deeper black, punctuated by 2 points of cold, silver fire. It did not move as the ragged Roman column staggered to a halt at the edge of the stone circle, but its presence was a physical pressure, a weight of ages that pushed against them. The chanting ceased, leaving a silence more profound than any they had yet experienced. The shaman's voice, when it came, was not a sound heard with the ears, but a thought planted directly into their minds. It was the dry rustle of dead leaves, the grind of continental plates, the whisper of stars dying. It spoke not in Latin, yet Marcus understood its meaning with terrifying clarity. It offered a choice, a final, terrible mercy. They could turn back now, leave this sacred ground, and in doing so, be erased. Not just killed, but unmade. Every memory of them, every record of the Ninth Legion's march north, every tear shed for them by loved ones, all would be pulled from the tapestry of history as if they had never been. The alternative was to stay, to join the endless procession of those who had dared to defy the gods of this place. They would become eternal marchers, their souls bound to the mist, repeating their futile invasion for all time, a ghostly warning to any who would follow. The offer hung in the air, a poison that seeped into the minds of the terrified legionaries. To be forgotten, to have one's very existence scoured from the world, was a horror that struck at a Roman's deepest desire for glory and legacy. Yet the alternative was a damnation beyond comprehension. Marcus felt the weight of every eye upon him. He saw the hope of oblivion warring with the terror of eternity on the faces of his men. For a fleeting second, the temptation to surrender, to accept the clean erasure, flickered within him. But then he saw the shaman's silent, swirling face and the pride of Rome, brittle and desperate, flared into a final, defiant rage. He would not bargain with phantoms. He would not let his legion be unmade by mist and shadow. His honor, however meaningless here, demanded one last, violent act. His voice tore from his throat, a raw, ragged shout that shattered the oppressive silence. Attack! For Rome! Forward! He drew his gladius, the cork, familiar rasp of steel, a comforting anchor in the sea of the impossible, and leveled it at the circle of stones. The order, a relic of a world that no longer applied, was echoed by his centurions, their voices thin and desperate, with a collective roar born of terror and a final fleeting grasp at their training. The remaining legionaries surged forward. Shields were raised, swords were brandished, and the tight Roman formation charged into the stone circle. A wave of steel and flesh crashing against the supernatural. They met only air. The moment the first Roman foot crossed the invisible boundary of the monoliths, the chanting mistwalkers dissolved. Their forms unwound like smoke, their burning eyes winking out, their presence reabsorbed into the general mist in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The legion's charge carried them into the center of the empty circle, their war cries dying in their throats. They stumbled to a halt, their weapons slashing at nothing, their shields bashing against empty space. They spun around, panting, their eyes wild, searching for an enemy that was no longer there. The stone circle was empty, save for the Romans themselves and the towering, silently pulsing monoliths. The shaman was gone. The tribe had vanished, leaving behind only the echo of their chant and the chilling memory of their choice. The Romans stood heaving in the center of the ancient ring, their swords point down in the dirt, their defiant attack having struck nothing but mist, the crushing certainty of their powerlessness, finally and utterly complete. The silence that followed their futile charge was the most profound yet, a vacuum that seemed to suck the very breath from their lungs. It lasted only a moment. From the center of the stone circle where the shadow shaman had stood, the ground itself exhaled. A low, subterranean groan vibrated through the soles of their sandals, a sound of ancient stone shifting against its will. Then the mist, which had hung like a passive observer, began to move. It did not drift, it surged. From the base of each monolith, from the damp earth between the stones, a thick white vapor poured forth, coalescing into a single towering wall that began to spin, slowly at first, then with accelerating, terrifying speed. It grew, climbing higher than the tallest pine, a churning vortex of solidified cloud that blotted out the bruised twilight sky, its top lost in a roiling ceiling of grey. This was no natural fog. It was a tidal wave of pure malevolent force, and it began to descend upon the stone circle. The first soldiers to be touched by the advancing wall did not have time to scream. They were simply absorbed. A legionary on the outer edge of the formation raised his shield in a final, instinctive gesture of defense. The mist washed over him, and for a heartbeat, his form was visible within the vapor, a dark silhouette frozen in time. Then he dissolved, his body unraveling into strands of darkness that were swallowed by the hungry grey. Another man turned to run, only for a tendril of the mist to lash out like a whip, wrapping around his ankle and yanking him off his feet. He was dragged into the churning wall, his desperate scrabbling fingers leaving furrows in the moss before he too was gone. The wall advanced, an inexorable, silent predator, swallowing men whole, leaving behind not even a ripple to mark their passing. Chaos erupted. Swords were drawn, not against a visible foe, but against the mist itself. Legionaries slashed and stabbed at the coiling tendrils that reached for them, their gladius blades passing through the vapor with a hiss, meeting a resistance that was both intangible and impossibly solid. The air filled with the frantic, useless clang of steel against nothingness and the raw, terrified shouts of men fighting for existence that was being systematically erased. Lucius found himself fighting back-to-back with Centurion Marcus, their world reduced to a few feet of contested ground. Lucius parried a tendril that solidified into the shape of a spear point, his arm shuddering with the impact. He felt a cold, wet grip seize his calf, a sensation like being held by a corpse pulled from an icy river. He hacked downward with his sword, severing the misty appendage, which dissipated with a sound like a sigh. The cold lingered in his flesh, a deep, bone-aching numbness that promised a more permanent embrace. The world around them began to blur, the edges of reality softening and running like wet ink. The solid stone monoliths seemed to waver, their outlines becoming indistinct. Time, already fractured, now shattered completely. From within the churning heart of the mist, voices echoed, not the guttural chants of the tribe, but their own. They heard Marcus's orders from hours ago, his speech about Roman duty, his command to attack the stone circle, all playing back at once, a jumbled, overlapping cacophony of their own past decisions. They heard Lucius's youthful laughter from the first day's march, now a ghostly, mocking sound. They heard the panic shouts of the vanished, the screams of the dragged, all woven into a tapestry of sound that was both memory and premonition. It was the echo of their own doom, a recording of their march into oblivion, playing on a loop for an audience of one themselves, trapped in the final, swirling moments before the mist claimed them all. The churning wall of mist fell upon the stone circle, not as a wave, but as a mouth. It did not crash, it consumed. One moment, a century of men stood in a desperate testudo, shields locked, their faces grim masks of defiance. The next, the living vapor washed over them, and when it receded, the space they had occupied was empty. No bodies, no dropped weapons, not even a lingering cry. They were simply erased, unmade with a silent, terrifying finality. The vortex of mist swelled, its spinning walls tightening around the heart of the Legion, pulling men into its gray, grinding heart. Centurion Marcus, his voice gone hoarse from shouting orders that were swallowed by the din, could only watch as the world dissolved around him. He saw a standard-bearer, the eagle held high, vanish into the gloom, the symbol of Rome's power, disappearing as if it had never been. He saw a young tribune, his face a rictus of terror, simply cease to exist as a tendril of fog brushed his cheek. The organized ranks of the 9th Legion, the finest fighting machine of the age, disintegrated into a screaming, scattering mob, each man alone in a universe of dissolving reality. When the mist finally stilled, its violent energy spent, the silence that returned was absolute and suffocating. The towering wall was gone, the stone circle was empty, and the vast highland clearing held only a handful of souls. Centurion Marcus stood swaying on his feet, his armor scuffed and his crimson crest torn. Beside him, Lucius leaned heavily on his gladius, his breath pluming in the suddenly cold, still air. Around them, perhaps 24 other legionaries remained, their eyes wide and uncomprehending, their forms seeming small and insignificant in the vast, grey landscape. 5,000 men had marched into the highlands. Now, fewer than 30 stood in the aftermath. The silence, a heavier burden than the vanished screams of their comrades. They were the dregs, the leftovers of a feast for some ancient, insatiable god. Disorientation was a physical force, a dizzying sickness that had less to do with the head and more to do with the soul. Marcus tried to form a coherent thought, to issue a command, but the words died before they reached his lips. There was no command to give. There was no enemy to fight, no position to hold, no path to follow. He simply gestured, a weak, vague motion forward, and the shattered remnants of his command stumbled after him. They moved without purpose, a ragged line of ghosts drifting through a world that had rejected them. Their march was a slow, shuffling walk, their feet dragging through the heather. They did not speak. The horror was too vast for words. They marched for what felt like hours, or perhaps only minutes. Time had lost all meaning. The landscape repeated itself in a maddening loop of identical hills, identical stands of birch, identical banks of grey mist. Then Lucius, his eyes scanning the monotonous terrain with a desperate intensity, stopped dead. He pointed a trembling finger at a patch of churned mud ahead. There, lying discarded and forlorn, was a pile of their own equipment. A cracked shield bearing the insignia of the 8th Cohort. A water skin Lucius himself recognized from his friend Polo's pack. A pilum with a distinctively bent tip that a soldier named Gaius had been complaining about just 2 days prior. They were standing on the exact spot where they had first noticed their own footprints appearing ahead of them on the trail. They had been marching in a perfect, hopeless circle a loop within the greater loop of their damnation. As the others stared at the discarded gear, a silent testament to their own futility, Lucius's gaze was drawn upward. The mist to his right thinned, not into more highland wilderness, but into a vision that stole the breath from his lungs. For a single, breathtaking second, he saw a landscape of smooth black pathways snaking through the hills, upon which strange, wheeled metal boxes moved at impossible speeds. In the distance, a tall structure of glass and steel pierced the sky, and figures clad in bright, strange fabrics walked along a defined path, pointing devices at the scenery. The colors were vivid, the sounds a distant, mechanical hum. It was a world of sharp angles and audacious invention, a world that was not theirs. He took an involuntary step toward it, a desperate hope flaring in his chest. Then, as if a curtain had been drawn, the vision wavered and faded, replaced once more by the endless, familiar, gray desolation of the highlands. The modern world had been a glimpse through a keyhole that had now been firmly, irrevocably shut. The last vestiges of Centurion Marcus's leadership crumbled to dust within him. The sight of their own discarded equipment was the final proof of their entrapment, and Lucius's haunted description of the ghostly, impossible world sealed it. There was no forward, no back. There was only the circle. The weight of his failure, the loss of his men, the utter destruction of his purpose, settled upon him with a physical force that bowed his shoulders. He looked at the handful of survivors, their faces hollow, their eyes empty of everything but a numb acceptance. He had no speech to give them, no order to rally them. He was not their centurion here. He was just another lost soul. With a slow, defeated exhalation, he sank to his knees in the damp heat. His head bowed. The mist, patient and eternal, closed in around the small group, not as an attacker, but as a jailer. Its silent presence, the only confirmation they would ever receive. They were trapped. The swallowing was complete. Time became a flat, gray circle, a wheel upon which their souls were bound for eternity. The handful of survivors, the final dregs of the 9th Legion, no longer marched with purpose or destination. Their movement was the only constant, a slow, shuffling procession through a landscape that had become a prison of repeating hills, skeletal birch groves, and the ever-present, suffocating mist. They were caught between the seams of worlds, their feet treading a path that existed outside the flow of history, their bodies no longer wholly flesh, their spirits no longer free. They were echoes given form, condemned to reenact the final desperate days of their campaign in an endless, silent loop. Occasionally, the veil between their gray nowhere and the living world would grow thin. The mist would part like a stage curtain, offering them cruel, fleeting glimpses of reality they could no longer touch. They saw figures in bright synthetic fabrics, carrying strange packs, their faces animated with laughter and purpose as they trekked along well-defined paths, hikers from a future they could not comprehend. Once, a vision of a sleek metallic car, roaring along the black ribbon of road, shot past them in a blur of impossible speed and noise, its occupants oblivious to the phantom legion shuffling just yards away. Lucius would reach a hand toward these visions, his fingers straining, but they would pass through the image as if through smoke. There was no interaction, no sound, no sensation. They were ghosts watching the living, a silent audience to a play from which they had been permanently excised. Their own screams of frustration and despair, when they could muster the energy to voice them, did not echo. They simply blended with the constant, mournful wind, becoming just another part of the highlands' desolate soundtrack, unheard by any living soul. During the long, indistinguishable stretches of their march, Lucius's mind turned inward, seeking refuge in memories that were now as spectral as he was. He thought of his family's small farm outside of Capia, the warmth of the sun on the grapevines, a warmth he would never feel again. He pictured his mother's face, the lines of worry around her eyes when he had left for his first campaign, and his father's strong, calloused hand clasping his forearm in a final farewell. He thought of a girl with dark eyes and a quick smile, a promise of a future that had been stolen from him. These memories were vivid, sharp, and exquisitely painful. They were anchors to a life that had been erased, and with each step of the eternal march, he felt the anchors dragging along the bottom of his soul, tearing fresh wounds with every remembered smile, every echo of lost laughter. Centurion Marcus, however, did not retreat into memory. His was a spirit forged in duty, and even in damnation, he found a purpose. The chaos of the final swallowing had passed, leaving a grim, stark clarity. They were trapped, yes. They were damned, certainly. But they were still Romans. He straightened his back, the tattered crimson crest on his helmet, a defiant splash of color in the monochrome hellscape. He began to issue orders again, his voice a low, gravelly command that cut through the whisper of the wind. He enforced discipline, ensuring their ragged line remained as ordered as possible, that their few remaining weapons were clean, that they marched in time. It was a futile gesture, a pantomime of military order in a place that had no use for it. But it was all he had left. He vowed, silently, to the gods who had abandoned them, and to the empire that had forgotten them, that he would maintain order, even in damnation. He would be a centurion. Even as a ghost, he would lead. As this resolve solidified within him, so too did the mist around them. It was no longer a formless vapor, but began to take on a subtle, gelatinous consistency, a tangible prism that pressed against them with a gentle, inexorable pressure. It clung to their armor, beating on the cold metal like condensation on a tomb. It swirled around their legs, making each step a little heavier, a little more labored. It was as if the land itself, recognizing their eternal sentence, was finally making their prison physically manifest. The air grew thick, cold and heavy, and the world beyond their immediate shuffling forms faded into a solid wall of luminous gray. They were not just marching in the mist anymore. The mist was becoming them, and they were becoming the mist, bound together in an endless silent procession through the corridors of forever. The wind carried more than just the scent of damp earth and heather. It carried echoes. Alex MacLeod, his boots sinking into the soft peat of the Highland trail, paused, his breath pluming in the crisp autumn air. He was a man who sought solitude in the wild places, who found peace in the empty, sweeping vistas. But this sound was wrong. It wasn't the cry of a distant bird or the rustle of a red deer in the bracken. It was the distinct, metallic clang of swords meeting in violent opposition, a sound that belonged in a museum or a film, not here in the silent, ancient hills. It was followed by sharp, guttural shouts, words barked in a language he didn't understand, but whose cadence was unmistakably that of military command. Latin. The words were swallowed by the wind almost as soon as they were born, leaving behind a ringing silence that felt heavier than before. His heart, a steady drum against his ribs, began to beat a frantic tattoo. He stood frozen on the path, his senses straining against the oppressive quiet. The rational part of his mind, the part shaped by a modern world of science and reason, insisted it was a trick of the wind, an auditory hallucination, born of fatigue. But the primal part, the part that still listened for predators in the dark, knew better. The sounds had been real. Compelled by a morbid curiosity that overrode his fear, he left the worn path and pushed through a thicket of gorse, its yellow flowers a stark contrast to the pervasive gray of the day. His eyes scanned the ground, searching for a logical explanation, a fallen hiker with a metal walking pole, a discarded piece of farm equipment. What he found was neither. It lay half buried in a tuft of wet moss, as if the earth had tried and failed to fully claim it. A dagger. Not a modern survival tool, but an ancient, brutal-looking weapon. Its short, double-edged blade was thick with a crust of reddish-brown rust, but its distinctive leaf shape was unmistakable. A Roman pugio. Alex, a history enthusiast, recognized it instantly. His breath caught in his throat. He knelt, his fingers hesitating just above the cold iron. This was an artifact, a piece of a world that had vanished from these hills nearly 2 millennia ago. It should have been in a glass case, not lying in the open, waiting for him. As his fingertips finally brushed against the pitted metal, a jolt, not of electricity, but of profound, soul-deep ice, shot up his arm. It was the cold of a deep grave, of centuries of frozen stillness. At that moment, the air around him changed. The light autumn mist that had clung to the higher peaks all day began to descend, not as a gentle fog, but as a swift, silent tide. It poured into the small hollow where he knelt, thick and white, moving with an unnerving purpose. It was colder than any natural mist, a damp, clinging cold that seeped through his waterproof jacket and bit into his flesh. The world vanished, swallowed by a luminous, swirling grey void. The familiar sounds of the highlands, the wind, the distant bleat of a sheep were extinguished, replaced by a silence so absolute it felt like a physical pressure on his eardrums. And within that silence, he heard them again. The ghostly clash of arms, the faint, desperate shouts. In Latin, the rhythmic, phantom tramp of countless marching feet. They were all around him, invisible, eternal. Panic, pure and undiluted, seized him. He scrambled backward, his hand closing convulsively around the icy dagger, and then he was running, stumbling blindly through the opaque wall, driven by a terror he had never known. The Phantom Legion's echoes chasing him all the way back to the safety of the paved road. In the warm electric-lit pub of the nearest village, his story was met with polite, knowing smiles. The locals, their faces etched with the history of the land, listened patiently as he spilled his tale. The rusted Pugio, lying on the scarred wooden table between them, like an accusation. They nodded, called him a dram of the good whiskey, and spoke of the old tales. They told him of the marching dead, a lost Roman legion cursed, to wander the high mists for all time, a story their own grandparents had told them. They dismissed his terror as a brush with local folklore, story made real by an overactive imagination and a lucky find. They clapped him on the back, told him he'd had a true Highland experience, and sent him on his way. But their folkloric comfort was a flimsy shield against the memory of that unnatural cold and the sound of those phantom swords. That night, and for many nights after, sleep offered no refuge. Alex was haunted by dreams that were not dreams, but vivid, visceral replays. He stood again in that hollow, but this time he could see them. An endless column of spectral soldiers in tarnished Roman armor, their faces gaunt and hollow-eyed, marched past him in perfect, silent unison. Their forms were semi-transparent, woven from the same mist that had enveloped him. He saw the centurion at their head, his face a mask of grim, eternal resolve, and a younger legionary whose eyes, for a fleeting second, seemed to meet his own, filled with a despair that spanned centuries. He would wake gasping, the sheets tangled around him, the echo of their silent marching still pounding in his ears. The memory of the rusted Pugio's icy touch burning on his skin, a permanent, chilling souvenir from a world that was supposed to be dead. The report from the Highlands landed on Dr. Eleanor Reed's desk like a message from another world, buried amidst interdepartmental memos and carbon dating requests. It was a hiker's account, typed in the straightforward language of a man not given to flights of fancy, which made its contents all the more compelling. Alex MacLeod's description of hearing phantom battle cries and finding a rusted Roman Pugio in a sudden, inexplicable mist was a siren's call to a mind like Eleanor's. For years, she had been piecing together a mosaic of anomalies from the region folklore, strange meteorological data, scattered archaeological finds that defied easy classification. This was the keystone, her office. The cozy chaos of stacked books and scattered maps seemed to shrink as she read. The modern world fading away, replaced by the ghostly highlands and the echo of lost legions. She spent the next days in a feverish haze, the report a constant presence on her desk. The legend of the lost Ninth Legion of Rome, the Hispana, was one of history's great cold cases. The official record stated they had been transferred to the Rhine, or simply disbanded. But the whispers had always persisted. A whole legion, 5,000 men, vanishing without a trace in the mists of Caledonia. She pulled every extant text, every fragmentary account of Governor Agricola's campaigns. She cross-referenced them with local Scottish folklore, tales of the Silent March and the Grey Host, spectral soldiers seen on fog-bound nights. The details aligned with a terrifying symmetry. The descriptions of an unnatural, clinging mist, the disorientation, the temporal distortions. Alex's account of the cold of hearing his own death was not just a ghost story. It was a piece of a pattern that pointed toward a profound and active temporal disturbance. The site wasn't just an archaeological dig. It was a wound in time, and she was planning an expedition to step into its scar. She found a skeptical audience in her colleague, Dr. Ian McCulloch, a man whose world was built on stratigraphic layers and verifiable carbon dates. Over coffee in the university cafeteria, under the harsh fluorescent lights, she laid out her theory. She spoke of the Pugio, the folklore, the historical records, the whispers of temporal loops. Ian listened, stirring his coffee with a slow, deliberate clink of the spoon. His expression was a mask of polite incredulity. He warned her against chasing wild theories, of tainting her professional reputation with paranormal speculation. He spoke of pareidolia, of the human mind's ability to find patterns in chaos, of the simple logical explanations for cold spots and auditory hallucinations in the unpredictable highland weather. His words were a bucket of cold water, meant to douse the fire of her obsession. But the cold water only hardened her resolve. As Ian spoke of professional caution, Eleanor felt not dissuasion, but a profound and magnetic pull. It was a feeling that went beyond academic curiosity, a deep, instinctual certainty that she was on the verge of something monumental. Staring out the cafeteria window at the rain-slicked streets of Edinburgh, she didn't see the modern city. She saw the ghostly outlines of the highlands, the swirling mist, and the faint, desperate faces of soldiers marching through the centuries. Ian's skepticism was the voice of the safe, known world. The call from the mist was the voice of the truth. However terrifying it might be, she thanked him for his concern, gathered her papers, and walked away, her mind already racing with logistics, equipment lists, and grant proposals. The truth was out there, trapped in the gray nowhere, and she was going to bring it into the light. The soil itself seemed to hold its breath, a compacted archive of centuries waiting to give up its ghosts. Doctor. Eleanor Reed's team moved with a quiet, focused energy, their trowels scraping against the peat and stone in the shadow of the ancient monoliths. The stone circle stood silent and imposing, its lichen-crusted sentinels watching over the excavation with an air of timeless judgment. From the first scrape of the turf, the dig yielded not a clear, stratified timeline, but a chaotic jumble of errors tossed together as if by a careless giant. A volunteer's trowel unearthed a silver denarius bearing the stern profile of Emperor Domitian, its surface miraculously preserved. Just inches away, nestled in the same dark soil, lay the crumpled aluminum shell of a modern soft drink can, its logo a garish splash of color against the earth. A rusted iron nail of Roman design was found beside a plastic button from a hiking jacket. Each find was a paradox, a violation of archaeological principle that sent a thrill of terrified excitement through Eleanor. Time was not layered here. It was a soup, and they were stirring the pot. As the sun began to dip below the hills, casting long, distorted shadows from the standing stones, the team deployed their more sensitive equipment. Digital voice recorders were placed at the cardinal points of the circle, their tiny red lights glowing like malevolent eyes in the twilight. The initial playback, listened to through headphones in the quiet of the field tent, was a study in static and wind. But then, beneath the hiss, the sounds emerged. At first, it was a faint, rhythmic thumping, a sound that slowly resolved into the unmistakable, disciplined tramp of hundreds of marching feet, the crunch of hobnailed sandals, moving in perfect, ghostly unison. Then came the other sounds, agonized, wordless cries that seemed ripped from the soul, desperate gasps, and the faint metallic ring of swords being drawn. The EVPs were not clear, pristine recordings. They were echoes, faint and frayed, as if traveling a vast distance through time itself. But their horror was undiminished by the static. The team listened in stunned silence, the cheerful modern world of their camp, outside the circle, feeling 1,000,000 miles away. The following day, Alex McLeod arrived, his presence a tangible link to the site's living mystery. He stood at the edge of the excavation, his eyes scanning the familiar, yet now alien, landscape. He shared his experience with Eleanor, his words measured, but his eyes betraying the deep, unhealed trauma of his encounter. He described the unnatural cold of the Pugio, the way the mist had moved with sentient purpose, the clarity of the phantom marching sounds. His account was not the wild tale of a fantasist, but the sober testimony of a man who had touched the impossible, and his conviction lent a crushing weight to the team's own bizarre findings. He was no longer just a source. He was a witness, and his haunted gaze was a constant reminder that they were not merely studying history, but interacting with an active, dangerous phenomenon. That evening, as a thick highland mist began to coil around the base of the stones, the team activated a grid of thermal and electromagnetic sensors. The readouts, displayed on a laptop screen inside the command tent, initially showed the expected cool blues and greens of the evening air. Then, without warning, several sensors spiked. Vivid, localized patches of deep purple and black appeared on the thermal display, indicating spots of intense, inexplicable cold. These were not drafts. They were self-contained pockets of frigid air, hovering just above the ground in the center of the circle and near the largest monolith. A team member, braving the creeping chill, held a thermometer into one of the zones. The digital numbers plummeted, dropping 20 degrees in seconds, the cold leaching the warmth from his hand even through his glove. The sensors detected no corresponding electromagnetic surge, no logical source for the temperature drop. They were simply cold spots, voids of warmth in the world, as if a door to some frozen, timeless dimension had been briefly opened, letting a breath of its eternal winter seep into their own. The team worked in a hushed reverence, the data on their screens providing a cold, hard, scientific confirmation of the ghost stories, proving that the past was not dead here, but alive, trapped, and desperately eternally cold. The old woman's cottage smelled of peat smoke, dried herbs, and time itself. Seated in a worn armchair by the hearth, Mrs. Moray Campbell was a living archive of the glen. Her face, an intricate map of wrinkles, her eyes pale and sharp as quartz. For Dr. Eleanor Reed, the cozy interior of the cottage felt like a sanctuary from the unnerving chill of the stone circle, but the stories that unfolded within its walls were anything but comforting. Mrs. Campbell spoke, not as someone reciting folklore, but as a keeper of grim family truth, her gnarled fingers tracing the pattern of her woolen shawl as she gave voice to the highlands' oldest, most terrible secret. She called them the marching dead. She described seeing them on nights when the fog was not white, but a luminous, sickly gray, a mist that seemed to swallow sound and light. They were not solid, she explained, but figures woven from the vapor itself, a procession of men in ancient tarnished armor, their faces hollow with an exhaustion that spanned centuries. They marched in a silence that was louder than any storm, a relentless rhythmic tramp that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. But it was the screams, she said, that truly broke the heart. They were not constant, but would erupt from the mist without warning, raw, agonized cries of men dying in battle. The shouts of officers barking orders in a dead language, and then her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. She revealed the most chilling detail of all. Over the years, the languages of those spectral screams had changed. She had heard the battle cries in the Latin her own grandfather had told her about, but also in the guttural tones of older forgotten tribes, and sometimes she swore in languages that sounded harsh and modern, tongues she could not place, as if the Legion's damnation forced them to witness and echo every conflict that had ever stained their prison. Eleanor listened, her digital recorder whirring softly on the table. Between them, her own scientific skepticism crumbling under the weight of the old woman's unwavering certainty. Campbell's testimony was not a collection of superstitious fragments. It was a coherent first-hand account that wove together the threads Eleanor had been desperately trying to connect. The phantom marching, the temporal echoes, the changing languages. It was all there, preserved in the oral tradition of the glen. As the peat fire crackled and cast dancing shadows on the low-beamed ceiling, Eleanor mentally pieced together the Legion's fate. The Ninth had not been merely defeated. They had been punished. Their imperial hubris, their belief that Roman order could conquer even the ancient, sacred forces of the land, had been their undoing. The Mistwalkers, or the gods they served, had not simply killed the invaders. They had enacted a supernatural punishment of breathtaking cruelty, transforming the Legion's strength, their discipline, their unity, their relentless march into the very engine of their eternal torment. They were trapped in a loop of their own invasion, a perpetual monument to the folly of defying powers older than empires. Their endless march a stark lesson in the price of hubris, a warning whispered on the wind for 2,000 years. The trowel's edge scraped against something solid, a different timber than the surrounding peat. "Doctor." Eleanor Reed's breath hitched, not in triumph, but in a sudden, inexplicable chill that had nothing to do with the highland air. The afternoon sun, which had been a weak golden presence, was abruptly extinguished. It did not set. It was swallowed. A wall of fog, thick and unnaturally white, rolled over the ridge above the stone circle with the speed and silence of an avalanche. It was not the gentle drifting mist of the previous days, but a dense, purposeful tide that flowed into the excavation site, pooling in the trenches and swirling around the bases of the monoliths. In an instant, the world shrank to a radius of a few feet. The sounds of the dig, the murmur of voices, the scrape of tools smothered by the oppressive, cottony silence. Within the luminous gloom, figures began to coalesce. They were not solid, but woven from the mist itself, shimmering outlines of men in the distinct, segmented armor and crested helmets of Roman legionaries. They moved with the ghost of a disciplined march, their forms flickering in and out of existence, their faces pale, indistinct, smudges of despair. A graduate student cried out, dropping his clipboard as a phantom centurion strode directly through the space he had just occupied. The air left in its wake bitingly cold. The equipment, so reliable until now, betrayed them. The laptop screens flickered with frantic digital snow. The steady hum of the generator stuttered and died, and the sensitive microphones, meant to capture whispers from the past, erupted in a burst of frantic overlapping static from which sharp Latin phrases could be discerned. Adiuta and per Dios, pleas for help and desperate calls upon the gods. Alex McLeod, who had been helping to sift soil near the largest stone, froze. His blood ran colder than the sudden drop in temperature. The spectral march was not a distant echo this time. It was here, among them. His eyes locked on one figure, a younger legionary who seemed more defined than the others, his face etched with a specific, personal anguish that transcended the centuries. It was the same face from his dreams, the same hollow-eyed soldier. As the phantom marched past, its arm, semi-transparent and shimmering, swung close to Alex's own. A compulsion, a desperate need to confirm the impossible, seized him. His hand began to rise, his fingers stretching out, yearning to bridge the gap of 2 millennia. He was inches from touching the shimmering form, close enough to feel the vacuum of cold that surrounded it. When the legionary's head turned, those haunted eyes, pools of timeless suffering, seemed to focus not on Alex, but through him, staring into the void of his own damnation. The connection was not one of recognition, but of a shared, hopeless captivity. The moment shattered Alex's nerve, and he snatched his hand back, the phantom's icy aura having already leached all warmth from his flesh. Eleanor Reed's voice cut through the panicked whispers of her team, sharp and authoritative, a lifeline thrown into the sea of fear. This was not a passive haunting to be recorded and studied. The mist was not a relic. It was a phenomenon. And it was active. The malfunctioning equipment, the tangible code, the clarity of the apparitions. It was all escalating. They were not observers here. They were participants, intruders in a delicate and dangerous equilibrium that had held for 2,000 years. The stone circle was not a simple archaeological site. It was the epicenter of a wound in time, and the wound was bleeding into their present. Everyone, now. Back to the vehicles. Leave everything, she commanded, her own heart hammering against her ribs. The retreat was a frantic, stumbling rush through the blinding whiteness, the ghostly legionaries flickering around them like projections on a screen of vapor. Their silent, eternal march a terrifying farewell as the modern world fled before the returning power of the ancient mist. The world inside the rented cottage was a fortress against the highland chill. Its walls lined with books and its floor a mosaic of open artifact boxes and scattered papers. For Dr. Papers, for Dr. Ferd, Eleanor Reed, the retreat from the stone circle had not been a surrender, but a strategic withdrawal. The terror of the active mist and the ghostly legion had been real, but it had also been a catalyst, shattering the last of her academic detachment and replacing it with a fierce, focused hunger for the underlying truth. The phenomenon was not a ghost story. It was a system, a mechanism with rules and a history. And she was determined to find its blueprint. The key, she felt, lay not just in the Roman past, but in the centuries that followed, in the accounts of others who had brushed against the same impossible reality. It was in a dusty, long-forgotten archive of a London exploration society that she found him, Alistair Finch Hatton, a Victorian gentleman explorer with a taste for the occult and a florid, dramatic prose style. His personal journal, bound in cracked leather and filled with precise, looping script, was a revelation. He had traveled to the same glen in 1887, drawn by the same local legends. His account was not of vague phantoms, but of specific terrifying encounters. He described hearing the clangor of antique arms and seeing through his brass telescope a procession of spectral Romans marching in a luminous and malevolent fog. But Finch Hatton had been a man of his age, obsessed with classification and theory. He did not dismiss what he saw. He tried to explain it. He hypothesized a temporal rift, a tear in the fabric of time itself, which he believed was not a natural phenomenon, but a deliberate creation. He theorized it was a weapon of tribal magic, a final devastating ritual enacted by the druidical priests of the mists to punish and imprison the invading legion, trapping them outside the stream of history as an eternal warning. Eleanor spread the fragile journal open on her work table, its pages illuminated by the warm glow of her desk lamp. Beside it, she placed her own notes, the translated fragments from the Roman historian Tacitus, and the few fragmented military dispatches that mentioned the Ninth Legion's campaign. It was there she found the corroborating voice from the past, the Legion's own seer Decimus, the man whose grim prophecy Centurion Marcus had barely tolerated. The Roman accounts, dry and official, nonetheless recorded his warnings, verbatim, treating them as a curiosity. Decimus had spoken of the gods of stream and stone, ancient deities of the land who were clothed in mist and fed on thyme. He had warned that to disturb their sacred places was to risk being unwoven from the great tapestry, to become shadows that march to no drum but eternity. Sitting in the quiet of the cottage, with the frantic looping script of the Victorian explorer on one side, and the stark missy and quiet by of the Cordi. Bureaucratic Latin of the Roman records on the other, the final, horrifying pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. Finch Hatton's temporal rift and Decimus's unweaving were two different languages describing the same monstrous truth. The mist was not merely a haunted place or a weather pattern. It was a prison. A sophisticated supernatural construct designed not just to hold the Legion, but to actively sustain their punishment. The ancient gods Decimus had named were not metaphorical. They were the sentient cosmic forces that powered the mechanism, using the tribe's ritual as a key to lock the door. The Legion's eternal march was the fuel, their despair and hubris the sustenance that kept the temporal prison operational. They were not just lost in time. They were a battery for it, their endless looping suffering generating the very energy that bound them. A self-perpetuating engine of damnation built by tribal magic and maintained by powers as old as the hills themselves. The understanding was a cold weight in her stomach, a far more terrifying reality than any simple ghost story. The air in the stone circle did not simply grow cold. It crystallized, becoming a sharp, brittle medium that carried the past with the clarity of a shattering lens. Alex and Eleanor stood at the edge of the excavation, their breath pluming not as vapor, but as faint, glittering clouds of ice. The scientific instruments were silent, their power drained by the sudden, profound drop in temperature, but the world itself had become a sensor, vibrating with an energy that was both ancient and agonizingly present. The mist, which had receded to a silvery veil hanging between the monoliths, began to thrum with a low, resonant hum, the sound of a plucked string, the size of the sky. Then the echo arrived. It did not fade in from a distance. It manifested fully formed, a phantom legion marching in perfect, silent unison through the very center of the stone circle. They were not the shimmering, half-seen wraiths of before. These figures had a terrible solidity, their armor scuffed and muddy, their faces gaunt with a hunger that was more spiritual than physical. They were oblivious to the two modern interlopers, their eyes fixed on some distant, unreachable point on their eternal path. The crunch of their hobnailed sandals on non-existent gravel was a sound felt in the bones rather than heard by the ears, a vibration that rose through the soles of their boots and into their spines. Alex and Eleanor stood frozen, not in fear, but in a state of rapt, horrified witness as the ghostly column of the Ninth Legion marched past them, close enough to touch, yet separated by an impassable gulf of centuries. A figure on the edge of the formation drifted slightly from its course, its glazed eyes staring into the gray nowhere. It was Lucius, his youthful features hardened by an eternity of despair, his form so tangible that Alex could see the individual links of his chainmail and the grime under his fingernails. The ghostly legionary adjusted his step, his path angling directly toward where Alex stood. For a heart-stopping moment, a collision seemed inevitable, a meeting of flesh and phantom. Alex braced himself for futile instinct as the spectral form drew nearer, the air around it screaming with a vacuum of cold. At the last possible second, Lucius's ghost phased through the space Alex occupied, a wave of soul-numbing ice passing through his body, leaving behind a memory of loss so profound it felt like a physical wound. There was no recognition, no awareness, only the endless, mechanical motion of the march. Above the silent tramp of feet, a voice cut through the temporal static, sharp and commanding. It was Centurion Marcus, his tone frayed with a desperation he would never allow his men to see, yet burning with an unextinguishable core of resolve. The words were Latin, but their meaning was seared into the air itself. Orders to hold the line, to remember their duty, to press forward. The voice was not an echo from a recorder. It was happening now, a live broadcast from a moment 2,000 years past, trapped in an endless loop and bleeding into the present with unbearable clarity. It was the sound of leadership in the face of the impossible, a defiant roar against the dying of all light, and it hung in the crystallized air, long after the spectral centurion had marched out of sight. On the table beside them, a single battery-powered EMF meter, forgotten in the retreat, suddenly screamed to life. Its needle, dormant for days, slammed against the far right of the gauge, indicating a spike of raw, untethered energy that defied all known physics. At the same moment, Eleanor's personal digital recorder, which she had kept in her pocket, automatically activated, its red recording light glowing like a drop of fresh blood in the twilight. The device was capturing it all, the subsonic vibration of the march, the crisp, desperate Latin commands, the very texture of the haunted air. This was not an EVP, a faint whisper teased from static. This was a high-fidelity recording of an event that was not supposed to exist, irrefutable proof that the loop was not a legend, but a brutal, ongoing reality. As the last of the Phantom Legion faded back into the shimmering veil between the stones, the intense cold began to recede, and the oppressive silence returned. But something new lingered in the air, a palpable residue that clung to skin and cloth. It was the soldier's despair, a psychic miasma of broken hope and eternal fatigue. It was not an emotion. It was a physical presence, a weight that pressed down on their shoulders and made each breath an effort. Alex felt a profound, hollow ache in his chest, the ghost of Lucius's stolen future. Eleanor tasted the metallic tang of futility on her tongue, the essence of Marcus's crumbling command. They stood together in the silent circle, the recorder's light still blinking, the air still vibrating with the aftershock of the passing ghosts. They had not just seen an echo, They had been immersed in it, and the despair of 2,000 years of endless marching had permeated their very beings. A chilling baptism into the true nature of the Legion's damnation. The symbols did not yield their secrets easily. They were not a language to be translated, but a cosmology to be deciphered. A series of spirals, knots, and shadowy forms etched into stone and bone that seemed to writhe under the focused beam of Eleanor's desk lamp. In the quiet sanctuary of the cottage, surrounded by the artifacts recovered from the stone circle, she worked with the intensity of a codebreaker at wartime. She had laid out the finds like pieces of a maddening puzzle. A fragment of a shale tablet covered in coiling patterns, a bronze amulet shaped like a swirling vortex, and the pitted surface of a monolith rubbing she had taken before the mist had driven them out. Each symbol was a frozen moment of a larger, terrifying truth. The repeating motif of a serpent eating its own tail was not just an Ouroboros, representing eternity. In the context of the other carvings, a stylized legionary trapped within the serpent's coil, his own footprints leading back into his mouth. It became a specific, horrifying diagram of a closed temporal loop. Cross-referencing these symbols with the translated chants from the Mistwalker ritual and the warnings from Decimus's account, the full, monstrous picture began to emerge. The gods of this place were not merely territorial spirits. They were custodians of a sacred balance, entities that governed the flow of time itself within the confines of the glen. The Legion's invasion, their violent, disruptive presence, had been like a hammer blow to a delicate, crystalline structure. The intricate carvings depicted the gods not as wrathful punishers, but as cosmic mechanics, manipulating the very threads of causality. Their punishment was not an act of anger, but a restoration of balance through a terrible, poetic justice. The invaders had sought to conquer space, so they were denied time. They had marched forward with the arrogance of empire, so they were condemned to march forever. Their linear progress twisted into a circle, their purpose become their prison. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, the magnitude of the revelation settling upon her like a physical weight. She theorized that the Legion's disruption had created a metaphysical dissonance, a tier that the tribal shamans, with their deep understanding of the land's sacred geometry, had been able to weaponize. The final ritual at the stone circle had not been an attack, but a locking mechanism. It had used the Legion's own violent intent, their collective hubris and disruption, as the energy source to power the temporal snare. The Eternal March was not just the punishment. It was the engine that sustained the prison. Their endless, repetitive suffering generated the psychic and temporal energy required to keep the loop sealed. A self-perpetuating system of damnation where the prisoners were also the fuel. The mist was both the wall of the cell and the warden, a conscious, supernatural force maintaining this perfect, terrible equilibrium. When Alex found her later that evening, she was still at her desk, her face pale in the lamplight, the translated symbols spread before her like a verdict. She explained it to him, not with the cool detachment of a scientist, but with the hushed reverence of someone who has stared into an abyss and seen its intricate workings. As she spoke of the Legion being trapped by the consequences of their own actions, of their disruption becoming their cage, Alex's own face grew still with a dawning personal recognition. The story of the ninth was not just an ancient tragedy. It was a dark mirror. He thought of his own life before the Highlands, the relentless, soul-crushing cycle of his office job, the same commute, the same screens, the same unfulfilling routines that felt like a different kind of eternal march. He had felt trapped, not by mist and magic, but by debt, by expectation, by the invisible walls of modern society. The Legion's fate was an extreme, supernatural allegory for the human feeling of being caught in inescapable cycles of work, of addiction, of destructive relationships, of history itself repeating its mistakes. Their story was a stark, 2,000-year-old lesson on the nature of fate and the elusive, often elusive, concept of freedom. The soldiers were prisoners of a spell, but he and countless others were prisoners of patterns they themselves perpetuated, and the desperate, silent cry from the mist was a universal one, echoing through the ages. The conviction that bloomed within Eleanor was not born of hope, but of a terrible, necessary certainty. The Legion was not merely lost. They were actively imprisoned, their suffering a cog in a cruel, supernatural machine. To study them was one thing, to leave them trapped, knowing the mechanics of their hell, was an act of moral cowardice she could not abide. The revelation of the loop's nature had not daunted her. It had given her a target. If the Mistwalker's ritual had used sacred geometry and chance to lock the door, then a counter-ritual, a key fashioned from both ancient knowledge and modern understanding, might just be able to pick the lock. The stone circle was not just a monument. It was the control panel for the prison, and she was determined to find the off switch. The plan was a fusion of archaeology and fringe science, a desperate prayer offered in the language of frequency and symbol. Under the flat, grey light of an overcast afternoon, she and Alex prepared the circle. Eleanor, clutching her translated notes of the Mistwalker chants, took her position at the central altar stone, her voice a low, steady murmur as she began to recite the inverted phrases, the pleas for release instead of binding, for dissolution instead of eternity. The ancient words, spoken with a modern accent, seemed to hang in the air, their meaning fighting against the ingrained resonance of the place. Meanwhile, Alex arranged the modern components of their attempt. He placed 3 compact frequency emitters at the points of a triangle within the circle, devices designed to output a complex, disruptive sonic pattern, theorized to interfere with coherent energy fields. When he switched them on, a low, almost inaudible thrumming vibrated through the soles of their boots, a mechanical counterpoint to Eleanor's primal incantation. As the chant and the emitters began to work in tandem, a subtle shift occurred in the atmosphere. The ever-present mist, which had been a passive, clinging presence, began to stir. It was no longer drifting. It was swirling, coiling into intricate, agitated patterns, as if stirred by an unseen hand. The air grew thick, charged with a static energy that made the hairs on Alex's arms stand on end. He worked quickly, adjusting dials on the emitters, his focus absolute, but a part of his mind was pulled elsewhere. He felt it again, that profound, icy connection. a thread of awareness that stretched across the centuries and hooked into his soul. It was Lucius. He could feel the ghostly Legionaries' presence strengthening, a flicker of something that was not quite hope, but a startled, painful awakening from the numb despair of the eternal march. It was as if the ritual was not just disrupting the mist, but amplifying the trapped souls within it, making them more real, more aware of their own torment. Then the circle erupted. The mist did not just swirl, it convulsed, lashing out in violent white tendrils that whipped through the air with a sound like tearing silk. The temperature plummeted, the damp highland air flashed freezing into a glittering frost that coated the ancient monoliths. And with the mist's violent reaction came the soldiers. They did not fade into view. They solidified, their ghostly forms snapping into a terrible, sharp-edged clarity. Dozens of legionaries became visible within the churning vortex, their faces no longer vague smudges, but contorted masks of shock, confusion, and a dawning. How? Port, confusion, and a dawning, agonizing awareness. They were no longer marching obliviously. They were stopping, turning, their spectral hands rising to shield their eyes from a light they could not see, their mouths opening in silent screams as the disruptive frequencies and reverse chants scraped against the fabric of their prison. The ritual was not a gentle knocking at the door. It was a battering ram, and the ghosts inside were finally, violently, reacting to the sound. The stone circle became the eye of a storm of unraveling reality. The low thrum of the frequency emitters and Eleanor's steady inverted chant were no longer separate forces, but a single, dissonant blade sawing at the bonds of time itself. The mist, which had been lashing out in agitated tendrils, now coalesced into a churning vortex above the center of the circle, a spinning maelstrom of luminous gray that pulsed with a sickening rhythmic light. At its heart, the air tore. A jagged vertical rift ripped open in the fabric of the world, a wound of pure, searing whiteness that bled not blood, but the raw energy of fractured centuries. Through this screaming gateway, the past bled into the present with a clarity that was physically painful to witness. And within that rift, for one breathtaking, heart-rending moment, he saw them. Centurion Marcus Valerius, his form no longer a shimmering phantom, but a man of desperate, solid flesh, his helmet gone, his face a landscape of exhaustion and crumbling resolve. His head turned, and his eyes, dark pools of a fatigue that had lasted 2,000 years, locked not on the rift, but through it. They found Eleanor, then Alex, standing in their world of technology and hope. There was no hatred in that gaze, no anger at the invaders disturbing his prison. There was only a profound, soul-crushing plea. It was the look of a drowning man who has seen a ship on a horizon he can never reach. A silent, desperate scream for a salvation he knew was impossible. The connection lasted less than a second, but the raw, unvarnished humanity in that glance was a brand seared into their minds. The Legion's response was a single, unified entity of torment. Their silent march shattered into a crescendo of sound, a cacophony of screams that had been pent up for millennia. It was not the noise of battle, but of realization. The agonized cry of 2,000 souls simultaneously understanding the true depth of their cage at the very moment its walls seemed to tremble. The swirling mist, acting as the prison's immune system, reacted with vicious force. Thick, muscular tendrils of vapor, now solid as ice and sharp as whips, lashed out from the vortex not at the ghosts, but at the source of the disruption. One such tendril, moving with the speed of a striking serpent, wrapped around Eleanor's ankle. The cold was instant and absolute, a deep freeze that shot through her leg and locked her joints. It yanked, pulling her off her feet, dragging her across the frosted ground toward the screaming white heart of the rift. Her chant became a gasp, her notes of liberation turning into a cry of terror as the timeless cold began to leach the warmth and life from her body. Alex saw her fall. The intellectual mission, the historical quest, vanished from his mind, replaced by a single, primal imperative. He lunged, his own body screaming in protest as he entered the fringe of the killing cold. He ignored the lashing tendrils, his eyes fixed only on Eleanor's outstretched hand. He grabbed her forearm, his grip locking like a vice, and planted his feet, pulling back with every ounce of strength he possessed. For a moment, it was a futile struggle, a man fighting the pull of an ocean. Then, with a final raw-throated shout, he wrenched her backward. They tumbled together in a heap, the frozen tendrils snapping like a rotten rope and dissipating into a cloud of freezing vapor. They scrambled away from the epicenter, their bodies shivering uncontrollably, the warmth slowly and painfully returning to their frozen limbs. Above them, the loop gave one final, monumental shudder. The temporal rift flared with a light that blinded the Legion's collective scream, peaked in a unified note of shattered hope, and the entire stone circle seemed to lurch, as if the world had been kicked off its axis. The vortex of mist convulsed, the ghostly soldiers within it flickering between agonizing clarity and near dissolution. For a single suspended heartbeat, it seemed the ancient bonds would break, but the power that held them was older than Rome, more patient than time. The shudder passed. The blinding light of the rift collapsed in on itself, snuffing out like a star. The vortex slowed, its spinning settling back into the familiar patient swirl. The soldiers' screams faded, not into silence, but back into the mournful, eternal wind. Their forms losing their terrible clarity, softening, becoming once more the shimmering, half-seen phantoms of an endless march. The loop had trembled, on the brink of oblivion, but it had not broken. The prison walls had held. As the last of the violent energy dissipated, the spectral legionaries faded away, not with a bang but with a whisper, their forms dissolving back into the mist from which they had been so violently summoned, leaving behind only the echo of their failed liberation and the crushing certainty of their continued, eternal wandering. The silence that fell was not peaceful. It was the silence of a scream that had been cut off, a held breath in the wake of a cataclysm that had failed to arrive. The air in the stone circle remained heavy, thick with the ozone tang of ruptured time and the psychic residue of 2,000 years of despair. Dr. Eleanor Reed and Alex McLeod sat huddled on the damp ground just outside the ring of monoliths, their bodies trembling not from the highland cold, but from the aftershock of their failed intervention. The electronic hum of the frequency emitters was gone, the devices themselves dark and silent, their internal circuitry fried by the backlash of energy. Eleanor's voice was raw, the inverted chants having scraped her throat bloody. They had thrown a stone at the Fortress of Eternity, and the fortress had not even shuddered. As their breathing slowly steadied, the echoes began to return. But they were different now. No longer the distant, muffled sounds of phantom battle. They were clear, distinct, and agonizingly personal. From the mist that still coiled lazily around the stones, voices emerged. They were whispers at first, then desperate, pleading phrases in crisp, educated Latin. "Liberate knows. Release us. Per misericordiam. By mercy. Redite nos domum. Bring us home." The pleas were not the shouts of soldiers, but the broken prayers of lost sons, husbands, and fathers, their imperial discipline finally stripped away to reveal the raw human terror beneath. Eleanor's digital recorder, which had miraculously survived the tumult, lay beside her. Up with a shaking hand and pressed play. The speaker filled the heavy air, not with static, but with the crystal clear, heart-wrenching audio of a dozen different voices, all begging for a release that would never come. It was irrefutable, a recording of a damnation that was still ongoing, a soundtrack for an infinite tragedy. Back at the cottage, surrounded by the mundane comforts of the modern world, the debrief was a somber, hollow affair. They spoke in low tones, their words measured. Eleanor laid out the cold, hard conclusion the failed ritual had forced upon them. They had not been fighting a ghost. They had been fighting a sentence. The temporal prison was not a malfunction to be fixed, but a verdict handed down by powers that operated on a scale they could not comprehend. They could record the echoes. They could theorize about the mechanics, but they could not grant pardon. The past was a country with immutable borders, and the fate of the Ninth Legion was a foundational law written into its constitution. To alter it was as impossible as catching mist in their hands. The realization was a weight that settled in the room, extinguishing the last embers of their hopeful resolve. As they packed their equipment into duffel bags and crates, the light outside the cottage window began to fail, painting the sky in shades of violet and gray. Alex was sealing a box of artifacts when he felt the familiar, soul-deep chill permeate the room. He turned slowly. There, standing between the bookcases, his form shimmering with the faint luminescence of mist, was Centurion Marcus Valerius. He was not the desperate, pleading man from the Rift, nor the grim commander of the Eternal March. His posture was straight, his bearing that of an officer to the last. His spectral eyes, ancient and weary, held a new expression not of hope, but of a profound, resigned gratitude. He looked from Alex to Eleanor, acknowledging their attempt, their witness to his legion's struggle. Then, in a gesture that bridged the chasm of centuries, he brought his clenched fist to his chest in a perfect formal Roman salute. It was a salute of respect, of farewell, and of absolution. He held the pose for a long moment, a final image of enduring duty before his form began to unravel. He dissolved not into nothingness, but into a gentle silver mist that drifted toward the ceiling and faded away, leaving behind only the scent of cold stone and a lingering sense of peace. The team finished their packing in a sober silence, the brief, poignant apparition having offered a closure the ritual could not. They loaded the vehicles under a canopy of emerging stars, the highlands once again, just a beautiful, rugged landscape. But they carried the weight of the glen with them. They had gone seeking a historical mystery and had found a living tomb. They had tried to play the role of liberators and had been firmly put in their place as witnesses. As the headlights cut through the darkness, leading them away from the stone circle and back toward the world of logic and linear time, not a single person in the convoy looked back. They were all lost in their own thoughts, each one sobered and forever changed by the intimate, heartbreaking encounter with an eternity of marching men. The story, once a secret whispered by the wind and the stones, was now bound in the crisp pages of an academic journal and the glossy cover of a popular history book. Dr. Carver Popular History Book. Eleanor Reed's monograph, The Ninth Legion, Echoes in the Mist, was met with a flurry of interest that quickly settled into a comfortable, accepted niche. It was discussed in university seminars and featured in documentaries with dramatic reenactments and moody music. The archaeological community praised her thoroughness while quietly dismissing the more speculative conclusions as a necessary concession to public appeal. The paranormal enthusiasts embraced it as a foundational text, a rare case of rigorous scholarship lending credence to their beliefs. The fate of the Ninth Legion was no longer a mystery. It had become a legend, a beautifully tragic story to be filed away alongside Atlantis and El Dorado, a haunting tale. But one that belonged firmly to the past, its edges softened by the distance of print and pixels. Eleanor had given the world an answer, and in doing so, had rendered the terrifying active truth of the Glen into something safe, manageable, and forever lost to the realm of academic debate. Alex MacLeod did not return to his old life. The city, with its gridlocked streets and humming servers, felt like a shallow, frantic dream. The memory of the mist of Lucius's hollow eyes, of the centurion's final salute, had carved a new channel in his soul. He moved to a small cottage on the edge of the highlands, and his hikes through the glens became a daily pilgrimage. He no longer walked for solitude or scenery, but with a quiet, empathetic vigilance. He no longer feared the echoes. He listened for them. Still afternoons, when the light was low and the air was clear, he would sometimes pause on a high ridge and hear it, the faint rhythmic tramp of phantom feet, the distant metallic clang that was not quite a sound, but a vibration in the soul. He did not run. He would simply stand, a silent witness, and offer a moment of his own peace to the endless turmoil, a small human counterweight to the vast impersonal machinery of their damnation. On a day of fierce, scouring winds that ripped the clouds to tatters and bent the heather flat, a new hiker made her way up the well-trodden path toward the high passes. She was young, her backpack new, her face alight with the simple joy of exertion and wild air. The wind whipped her hair and roared in her ears, a primal force that made her feel alive. As she crested a rise, the gale snatched something from the air and carried it to her. A sound so faint and strange it might have been imagined. It was a distant, metallic clang, like a great bell, struck once and then swallowed by the storm. It was followed, a heartbeat later, by a sharp, desperate cry that rode the wind, a single guttural word in a long, dead language. "Percute! Strike!" The sound was gone as quickly as it came, lost in the howl of the wind. The hiker paused, shrugged, and attributed it to a trick of the air or a distant farmstead. She zipped her jacket higher against the chill and continued on her way, her mind already moving on to the next peak, the next view, the next item on her life's agenda. She was utterly unaware that she had just brushed against the edge of an eternal war, that her ears had been grazed by the dying plea of a ghost. A brief moment of unknowing contact served as the story's final, quiet testament. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved, only endured. Some doors, once locked, cannot be reopened. And high in the lonely, wind-scoured peaks, far from the pages of books and the comfort of modern reason, the Phantom Legion marches on, their footsteps a silent drumbeat to a battle that never ends, their souls trapped forever between the worlds of the living and the dead, a timeless, sorrowful procession in the heart of the enduring mist.